All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're tackling a massive topic, one that has literally shaped modern India's economy and society: land reforms. This isn't just about economics. It's a story of justice, of power, and really a battle for the soul of the nation that was fought right in its fields. So, let's get into it. So, why are we kicking things off with this? Simple. For your exams, understanding land reforms is absolutely non-negotiable. I mean, think about it. It pops up everywhere. You've got it in GS Paper 1 in Modern History, it's in GS Paper 3 in the Economy section, and for sure it's a big deal in your optional paper. So, over the next few minutes, we're going to break down everything you need, the key concepts, the critical analysis, all the frameworks, so you can walk into that exam and write a top-scoring answer.
Okay, so here's the game plan. First, we'll dig into the colonial roots of the whole mess. Then, we're going to tackle the four main pillars of reform: abolishing those intermediaries, securing the tiller, setting land ceilings, and then the push for efficiency. And to finish, we'll wrap it all up by looking at the legacy, which will give you a fantastic framework for your conclusions.
All right, let's start at the very beginning. Why were land reforms even on the table? I mean, what was the problem? Well, the answer goes way back to the deeply exploitative system India inherited at independence. See, the British didn't design it for agricultural growth. No, it was all about one thing: extracting as much revenue as possible.
So the British had three main systems for this. You had the Rayatwari system, which was actually the most common, covering just over half the land. But it was the Zamindari system, covering a smaller slice, only about 19%, that became truly infamous. This was the system that just screamed exploitation. It caused so much distress out in the countryside, and really, it set the stage for all the conflict that followed.
Okay, so let's break down the key differences here. With Zamindari, you've got that middleman, the zamindar. In the Rayatwari system, at least on paper, the state dealt straight with the farmer, the Rayat. And then with Mahalwari, they just treated the whole village as one unit for collecting revenue. But here's the most important part, the real takeaway. Even with all these different structures, for the actual farmer on the ground, the result was tragically the same. We're talking crippling rents, crushing debt, and that constant fear of getting thrown off your land.
To really get a handle on this, I want you to picture something. This is our first memory anchor. Imagine the agricultural surplus, the profit, is like water flowing through a pipe from the farmer to the government. Now, the Zamindari system created this crazy thing called sub-infeudation. And what that means is you had layers and layers of rent collectors stuffed between the actual farmer and the zamindar. Every single one of them was like a hole in the pipe, just siphoning off their share. By the time it was over, the person actually doing the work was left with almost nothing. And that key word, sub-infeudation, you absolutely need to have that in your answers. Okay, quick pop quiz to lock this in. Just take a second and match these up. All right, got your answers? Let's see. Zamindari, of course, that's the one with the intermediary. Rayatwari, that's the direct connection to the Rayat, the farmer. And Mahalwari is the village-based system. Simple, right? But getting these basics down is absolutely crucial for what's coming next.
So with all that colonial baggage, independent India knew what its first target had to be: that whole intermediary system. And look, this wasn't just some minor policy tweak. Oh no, this was an all-out constitutional war. The goal was to tear down a feudal structure that had been there for ages and completely reshape who held power in the country. At the heart of it all was this huge clash, right? On one side, you had the fundamental right to property. On the other, the government's push for a fairer distribution of land. So what happened? The landlords took the government to court, obviously. And the government's response? A whole bunch of constitutional amendments. The big one you need to remember is the First Amendment in 1951. This is what created the Ninth Schedule, which was basically like a legal safe box to shield these reform laws from the courts. This whole legal back and forth went on for years, and it all came to a head with the 44th Amendment, which finally knocked the right to property down from a fundamental right to just a legal one. That was a game changer.
But here's the catch. Even while the government was winning these big battles in the Supreme Court, the landlords were busy finding ways to win on the ground. They got really good at exploiting legal loopholes. And the biggest one, by far, was this idea of personal cultivation. The law said landlords could keep land for their own use, their home farms or surlands. But the definition of cultivation was so ridiculously broad that just, supervising some workers was enough. It became this massive escape hatch for them.
Okay, and this is super important. Here's our first exam trap alert. It is so easy to make the mistake of saying that Zamindari abolition meant land to the tiller. That's just not the whole picture. The truth is that personal cultivation loophole led to huge mass evictions of tenants. The zamindars just kicked out the actual farmers, called the land their home farm, and basically turned themselves from old-school feudal landlords into modern capitalist farmers. It's a textbook case of unintended consequences, and you need to highlight that nuance in your answer.
So, since abolishing the intermediaries was only a partial win, the next logical step was to focus on tenancy reforms. The whole strategy shifted to three key things. First, regulate the rent. Second, give tenants some actual security so they couldn't just be kicked out. And third, the ultimate goal, give ownership rights to the person actually working the land.
And West Bengal's solution for the sharecropping problem was, well, it was kind of revolutionary. The law they passed was just brilliantly simple. It went like this. If the landowner gives you the inputs, the seeds, the cattle, whatever, the split is 50-50. Fair enough. But if the sharecropper, the Bargadar, uses their own inputs, then they get to keep 75% of the harvest. That simple 75-25 split was a massive deal. It was designed to completely flip the power dynamic and put it back in the hands of the tenant.
And that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? The end goal here wasn't just about getting a fairer rent, it was about getting ownership for the tiller. And across the whole country, two states really stand out for pursuing this with actual political guts: Kerala and West Bengal. Kerala went all the way and just legally abolished tenancy. And West Bengal had its famous Operation Barga, which was all about getting the rights of those sharecroppers down on paper and making them secure.
Okay, now we get to the really explosive stuff, the most radical part of this whole agenda: land ceilings. The idea itself sounds simple, but it was profound. They wanted to put a cap on how much land one family could own, and then take the extra, the surplus, and give it to people who had no land at all. I mean, this was a direct attack on the concentration of power, both economic and social, that had dominated rural India for centuries.
So, you might be wondering, how did this actually work on the ground? Well, it got complicated pretty fast. To try and be fair about it, officials came up with this idea of a standard acre, which was basically a unit based on how good the land was. So let's just walk through an example together. Step 1, the government sets a limit, let's say 25 standard acres for a family. Step 2, they look at what a family actually owns and convert it. So maybe their 12 acres of really good irrigated land plus 80 acres of dry land adds up to 35 standard acres. Step 3, do the math. 35 minus the 25-acre limit leaves a surplus of 10 standard acres, and that's the land the family had to give up.
But of course, in the real world, the landlords saw this coming from a mile off. So they started doing these massive benami transfers, illegally putting land in the names of distant cousins, their servants. There are even stories of them using their pets' names, anything to make it look like they didn't have any surplus land. So let's just pause here for a second. Put yourself in the shoes of a district collector back in 1972. What could you actually do on the ground to find and stop these fake paper transfers? Thinking about the how, the implementation, is what's going to make your answers really stand out.
So up to now, we've mostly talked about fairness and equity, but that was only one side of the coin. The reforms were also about boosting agricultural efficiency, and that meant dealing with a huge problem: fragmented land holdings. The two big ideas here were consolidation, getting all those little plots together, and promoting cooperative farming to get some economies of scale.
When you look at land consolidation, it's really a tale of two different Indias. On one hand, you have Punjab and Haryana. There it was a massive success. Bringing all those tiny, scattered plots together into one single farm, that's what literally paved the way for the Green Revolution. It suddenly made things like tractors and irrigation possible. But then you look at places like West Bengal, and the whole process just stalled. Why? Well, there was a real fear that it would hurt the sharecroppers whose rights weren't on paper. And that's a perfect example of that classic policy dilemma, the clash between efficiency and equity.
Okay, pay close attention, because here's our second exam trap alert. When you write about cooperatives in your exam, please do not just say they failed. That's too simple. You have to make a distinction. See, the joint farming cooperatives, the ones where farmers had to pool their land together, yeah, those mostly failed. Farmers are deeply attached to their own piece of land. But the service cooperatives, the ones that just provided things like credit and help with marketing while letting people farm their own land, those were actually quite successful. For a long time, they were the backbone of rural credit. Showing that difference, that's what shows real, nuanced understanding.
All right, let's pull all these threads together now. We're at the final section, and it's time to ask the big question. How do we actually judge this whole decades-long project? What were the big wins, the major failures, and what is the lasting legacy that land reforms left on India? Just look at these numbers from 1990. They tell a powerful story. You have almost 60% of farming families who are marginal. They have less than a single hectare. And all of them combined,
they only control 15% of the land. Now flip that. You have a tiny, tiny group, just 1.6% of large landholders, and they control a whopping 17% of the land. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that even after all those years of reforms, that deep inequality was still baked right into the system.
Okay, let's do a quick case study to really get you thinking analytically. Let's compare UP and West Bengal. In UP, they went for a very top-down, bureaucratic approach. Looked great in the files, but didn't have much impact on the ground. Then you have West Bengal's Operation Barga. It was a politicized approach. They mobilized peasants, they used party workers. It was messy, for sure, and super controversial. But it worked. They got the rights of over 1 million sharecroppers recorded. So the question for you is, which of these models teaches us more about what it takes to get real, genuine equity?
So, what's the final scorecard? Let's give you a solid framework for your conclusions. On the plus side, the reforms definitely got rid of the worst parts of that old feudal system. They did put a check on extreme land concentration, and places like Kerala and West Bengal showed that if you have the political will, big change is possible. Now, the minus side. The actual redistribution of land was tiny. Tenancy didn't disappear, it just went underground, based on shaky verbal agreements. And as we saw, inequality was still incredibly high. So really, the story of land reform in India is an unfinished one. It's a critical issue that's still shaping our rural world today. Now, for more detailed notes and a really useful mind map to help you revise all this, make sure you check out the links in the description. Keep pushing hard with your prep, and I'll see you in the next one.